Hello, and welcome back here to week 3. It's very exciting. I think we already have like 2/3 of the class through. It goes so fast, can't believe it. So we will dive right into our topic of the week, and that is the Middle East, North Africa, really a desert of democracy. I think there are a lot of cases you can make that it is not. Some you can make that it is. So let me walk through it. I will talk a little bit about key concepts of democracy. I think that's important for you. For your online discussion as well as your final paper this week, but also a little bit, what are the prerequisites for democracy? When does a country become democratic? Is it happening in the Middle East? And also, maybe we're looking at the completely wrong place if we ask ourselves why we don't have democracy in the Middle East. Maybe it's actually more about that authoritarianism was so successful. And then I will look a little bit at the Arab Spring and how that actually, these protests in 2011 actually changed anything or nothing in the Middle East. So you remember this map, Freedom House map from 2016 findings that basically gave the a very bad outlook for the Middle East, North Africa. Characterizes it at the most undemocratic region in the world, for decades, until the protests of 2010, 2011. Politics in the Middle East were almost, without exception, authoritarian. So the so-called Arab Spring seemed to really be the first time in history that we've seen any form of path towards democracy in the region. And academics and politicians alike were very excited about this opportunity. So in 2016, Freedom House looked at 195 countries worldwide and rated 86 free, 59 partly free, and 50 not free. So we do have a majority of countries in the world that are democratic here in green. And if you count the partly free countries towards it, we could say that over the years, even if you look at it, we had multiple waves of democratization over the across many countries. And the question is, of course, why did it never spark in the Middle East? So when we look at the countdown, and I've talked about this before, it's really only 17% of a total of 18 countries that are free. So we have Israel, Tunisia, and Turkey, and then Morocco, Kuwait, and Lebanon as partly free here, although Kuwait is counted as being not free in the most recent most recent report. So the overall 85% of all countries in the Middle East and North Africa are population is not free. So it's quite bad, and it's really gotten worse over the years. So before we get started with the Middle East and North Africa, I think it's important that we kind of look back a little bit. So what do we actually mean when we talk about democracy? Why is democracy actually so important? Why can we just not live with authoritarian regimes and we're fine? Why are we so obsessed with the idea of living in a democracy? A lot of some things you mean are pretty obvious. We obviously, we want the people, the demos here wants to have the power. Like here, this popular referendum in Switzerland. We meet really at a marketplace and you just raise your hands if you're against or for a law. That's how it works in Switzerland, but obviously it doesn't work for us here in the US, doesn't work in Europe. So why do we really need it? We cannot really meet and make our own decisions. Why do we need the representatives? And the idea really behind this is that when you have a democracy, you can prevent cruel and vicious autocrats. You just live better, longer lives with less violence. You can guarantee citizens fundamental rights. You have a broad range of personal freedoms that you otherwise won't have under a repressionist regime, and it's really a maximum of self-determination. You can go and draw up your own life to whichever extent you want to do it. That's definitely probably the most important difference. If you travel to the Middle East more extensively and you actually live there and compare it to what you do in the United States, you will notice it's quite significantly different. But then this is one piece that I think, apart from making people happy and being more free, is the biggest driving force behind governments promoting democracy in the world. Is it really just simply promotes peace and prosperity. So you can trade better, you have more peaceful relations with countries when they're democratic. And actually Imran Khan came up with that idea idea that that democratic peace theory, that proposes that that democracies are more peaceful in their relations with all other states in the system. It's called like the monadic democratic peace theory. And some other academics today also propose that democracies are more peaceful only in their relations with other democracies. That's a dyadic democratic peace theory. So if they're with somebody that's not democratic, then there's more likely to be war. And then others, again, argue that the more democracies there are in a region or the international system, the more peaceful the region or international system will be. So it's really about, also that's about keeping the peace or expanding the peace, but at the same time, when you have peace, you can also trade better. It's also, you can make better business with democracies, maybe. Some people maybe question that, especially when it comes to China, for example. But you can also, when there have been arguments out there that if China would be more democratic, you could actually really follow through the decision-making process and would be actually more likely to make business with a democracy. It is said, however, that the strongest relationships in terms of trade and the most successful trade powers in the world are democracies, again, apart from China, but paired to with being more peaceful, it definitely fits. Although we do have, of course, the United States being one of the most aggressive foreign powers since World War II in terms of military strength and activity, but it still has very peaceful relationships to democracies around the world. So with that in mind, let's look into really what's going on in the MENA. And I think it goes without saying that the MENA, even before, especially before the 2011 protests, and this is a map of the Freedom House rating in 2010, is definitely a desert of democracy. I mean, there's no question. We only had Israel here, and Turkey doesn't even count as being free. We had Morocco, Lebanon, and Kuwait, maybe to a certain extent, being partly free, although you can obviously debate that. But there's really no, dictatorships and authoritarian regimes prevailed, and there's really no other region in the world, maybe except Central and Eastern Europe, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that attracted as many efforts to promote democracy as the MENA regions. And many of these, of course, are controversial today. Obviously military intervention in Iraq, but also any form of interference in democratic ways of doing things. Of course, in all these countries are being seen skeptical for obvious reasons that we already talked about in other lectures. But academics really wonder why democracy did not happen in the MENA and why authoritarian regimes are so persistent. And it goes without saying that this argument, might even have changed after the Arab Spring. Everybody was very excited about what's going on. Maybe did that change anything? What academics are saying? Why we don't have democracy? Why we do have it? Then, what changed that we see in democracy developments all of a sudden in that region? I think there are two main explanations. First, we have roadblocks for democracy. That's part of one kind of camp that says there are just too many blockages for democracy in the region. That's why it can't happen. And the second one, which I think is almost a little bit more interesting, is that authoritarian regimes just have a very efficient and successful strategy to be persistent. And I think our readings really show that nicely. So let's dive into what I actually mean with that right away. So absent prerequisites for democracy are often cited by the media, for example, but also by maybe more superficial arguments. It's that we just is a very weak civil society. We're a very dominant public sector. We talked about this. A lot of people are co-opted by jobs in the government. The region is relatively poor. We have a high illiteracy rate, significant inequality. It's very remote from other democracies. Israel as a democracy in and of itself cannot accomplish the democratization of the entire region, obviously for obvious reasons, also not in a very good position to do so, but not even Turkey can. And then that's probably one of the most widely cited is Islam is just inhospitable to democracy. I will talk about this in an entire lecture. All of these are fairly insufficient explanations, and I think all of the readings kind of make that clear. Let me walk you through some of them when I talk about the Arab Spring in more detail. So actually, I think what makes more sense is to look at the conditions for authoritarianism. So we do have a couple of strategies for authoritarian regimes to stay in place. So they really look out for their fiscal health. They have an international support network usually that kind of legitimizes them on an international level and at the same time domestically. They have a strong level of patrimonial relations in their institutions, with very robust against reforms. We talked about it, like the system of patronage is extremely important for a regime to keep its power in place. So it's really a lot about the reinforcement of the cohesive apparatus and the prevention of democratic reform that are the main conditions for the survival of authoritarian regimes. And rather than looking at weak civil society or maybe even the role of the religion, I think it's much more helpful, much more stronger explanation if you actually look at the flip side and really look at how just really successful authoritarian regimes are in a region that is painted and characterized by conflict and influence of foreign powers. So what does that mean now if you look at what is its significance, if you say, for the democratic process here? So it is important then to keep in mind, so even if this authoritarian apparatus is removed, as we can basically see, and I will talk about that in a second, happened in the Arab Spring quite significantly, it's not necessarily a sufficient condition for democracy. Excuse me. You still have a lot going on underneath the surface. That is not necessarily doesn't mean democracy can sprout up, but only because the head of the authoritarian regime is cut off. I mean, there's this patrimonial system that still exists in bureaucracies and in multiple offices. I think they're actually under other conditions that are important. It needs to have a minimal level of commitment that when it comes back to the civil society. There needs to be a form of national solidarity, what we can also see, for example, in the case of Tunisia, and generally, interestingly, rising capita GNP. So if you can see, actually, how you have, that's one of the main explanations for Arab Spring. You have a relatively strong middle class that just have the perception of being less advantaged, and for example, especially for younger adults coming out of university getting jobs, that is actually much more important for a democratic process. So if this middle class really asks for a say in the representation in the government. And then, of course, then if you have a creation of state institutions, then it's important that you include the rule of law, and that's what Tunisia is doing quite interestingly in these days. Not easy, of course, in a time when chaos rules, like in Libya or Syria. So democracy simply cannot thrive in chaos. So while maybe sometimes in an overthrow of government you have chaos that leads to a democratic process, it's important that you actually calm the chaos down once democracy took over or is taking over. So Arab Spring, of course, is an interesting case in here. The Arab Spring and its aftermath pretty much changed or attempted to change everything we know about democracy in the Middle East. I don't think there was one single academic that wasn't excited about the new hope for democracy in the region. Let's look at the map. So we had, most prominently two regimes toppled in Tunisia and in Egypt. Several countries where the uprisings were crashed, and of course lots of fighting. So you can maybe make the case you only have the example of Tunisia that really is a country that was successful in their transition towards democracy. And if you look at the Freedom House ratings right after their that can kind of reflect that, right? I mean, you had still Israel being the only country that was free. Then Tunisia is today counted as a free country, but not necessarily right after the Arab Spring. It took a while. And then all others such unchanged, except of course Libya was not partly free anymore, but it was in a stage in between. So there has been, however, since then, the steepest decline in development towards freedom that we have seen in a while. So it was really a spring of democracy then with the Arab Spring. I would probably, there are of course some positive notes, and everybody always talks about Tunisia. I mean, the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet won the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in the Arab Spring in 2015. So, in a wave of protests, of course, entrenched regimes in North Africa and the Middle East, but the struggle for human rights and democracy was beaten back or slowed quite significantly in many countries. So this National Dialogue Quartet in Tunisia, consortium of 4 organizations, the Tunisian General Labor Union, the Tunisian Confederation of Industry, Trade and Handicrafts, and the Tunisian Human Rights League, and the Tunisian Order of Lawyers, succeeded really in creating a peaceful dialogue in civil society about where Tunisia should be going and how the democratic process should take place. So through a mediating role, the quartet allowed political and religious divides to be bridged and democratic development followed. But that's pretty much the only one. I mean, just take Turkey. I mean, even counting it now as democracy, it's still obviously technically democracy, but can be highly debated with the repressive response after the attempted military coup, if that's even still the case. Then look, of course, at Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, all countries that beat down on protesters. Then Libya, Syria are in civil wars. So we can see actually more instability in the region than we've probably ever seen. And then, of course, an ever ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Just recently, again, being on a high. So overall, I would say we actually have more persistence than change, and if you were pessimistic, you could even say towards change, if any change, probably more towards authoritarian repression than towards democracy. There are a couple unchanged conditions that I talked about. We still have a dominant public sector, still very remote from other democracies generally, but some conditions have changed. And that's me being a constant optimist, found it anyway interesting that these have changed. So we don't really have that weak of a civil society anymore. I think we have an emergent interest in social protest, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. There's a general more interest of the middle class in politics, although also obviously a much larger awareness of what happens if a country is unstable. For example, in the case of Morocco, also now Egypt. The idea for the economic recovery is the most important piece here of the explanation. The idea about having a poor, high illiteracy, significant inequality, the Camé readings really talk about this nicely. The high illiteracy rate is actually not true. I mean, we had a very high literacy rate in Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, for example. Some academics even take that as an example for why the Arab Spring protests happened in the first place. Yes, poor is true, but that didn't much change in the last couple of years, in the last couple of decades, so that is not an explanation why the Arab Spring then happened significantly. Significant inequality does not change also. I mean, it's still going on, but perceived inequality definitely changed. And then the idea of being in Islam being in a hospital for democracy was initially disproved. In the case, for example, of Tunisia, it's Islamic, at least partly painted government. But after the military coup in Egypt and the retreat of then Ennahda in Tunisia, the role of Islam is a very difficult line to walk. So interesting argument that is made here often is, and I will go into details that next lecture a little more, is that Islam was used for a long time to actually strengthen authoritarian regimes because the fear of just Islam is taking over the country, and then the international backlash against that actually helped solidifying authoritarian power. And then this fear kind of deteriorated with the rise of Ennahda and also the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And now we actually see that going back again with obviously the rise of ISIS and Islamist terrorism. It's much easier for these regimes to actually legitimate their power through inducing more fear, even in Islamist movements that might have anything to do with any radical political views. So there's some unchanged factors then that foster the coercive apparatus. It was mainly that, for example, still maintaining the regime's fiscal health is still the main focus. If you look at Morocco, Jordan, but also Libya and Egypt, a lot of countries were very successful in maintenance of their international support network. Very important in cases of countries that co-opted the protests, and they seek legitimization through international recognition, very foremost Jordan and Morocco here. The level of institutionalization that I talked about could still, prevent democratic outcome in the long run from the Arab Spring protests. So I would say there's definitely a reinforcement of the cohesive apparatus since the Arab Spring, and we can also say a reinforced prevention of democratic reform in the future. In this context, it's also interesting to see how, for example, the US or Europe has responded. And I talked a little bit to the protests, and I talked a little bit about their democracy promotion policy here. How did they actually deal now with these democracies in transition? That might be an interesting research question to look at. So let's democracy versus authoritarianism. You can say that absent prerequisites for democracy is a necessary but not sufficient explanation of lack of democratization. If there's any takeaway I want you to take from this lecture, it's this. But it's very important to look at the conditions of authoritarianism. So no debate on how democracy is doing or not doing should be going on without looking actually on the conditions of authoritarianism. And then after the Arab Spring, we really haven't seen many countries in democratic transitions, Tunisia being the most prominent example. And we see overall more persistence and change. So political change does not lead to democratization, but also reinforces a cohesive regime. And that then obviously differs from country to country. So in the next lecture, we'll look at the very interesting question of is Islam the solution, and also talk a little bit about this idea that Islam doesn't allow democracy, and we will engage with that a little bit more critically.